Rome, the heart of the ancient world, had grown accustomed to power. From the Palatine Hill, emperors ruled over seas and deserts, over armies and gods, believing that the will of a single man could hold together an empire. But with Caligula, that illusion shattered. What ascended to the throne was not a politician, nor a strategist, nor even a sane man, it was the birth of a creature forged from paranoia, privilege, and impunity. Ancient chroniclers described him with a mix of fascination and horror. Suetonius, for instance, portrayed him as an emperor who turned every gesture into a theatrical display of cruelty. At his banquets, where wine and music flowed as if the world had no limits, he could order a senator's execution before the guests and then calmly continue eating, indifferent to the dying man's convulsions. That was his idea of spectacle, power as pleasure, and the suffering of others as entertainment. The court, however, applauded. No one dared frown or look away. In Caligula's empire, silence was the safest way to survive. Everyone knew that a misplaced word could mean death, that an untimely laugh could cost an entire family. Rome had seen tyrants before, but none like him. Caligula demanded not just obedience, he demanded devotion. It wasn't enough for his subjects to serve him, they had to worship him. His private life was an extension of his power. In the gardens of the Palatine, surrounded by marble statues and perfumed fountains, banquets were held where wine mingled with fear. Some swore those gatherings were more like trials than feasts, each cup of wine a test of loyalty, each bite a reminder of who ruled. If the emperor smiled, the guest lived. If he frowned, someone disappeared. In public, he presented himself as a living god, in private, he was a man tormented by his own shadow. Those who knew him closely said he slept little, sometimes waking in the night screaming names from the past, as though haunted by the ghosts of his family. And with reason. He had grown up watching how power devoured his kin, how betrayal and suspicion mixed with daily bread. When he finally obtained the throne, he did not seek to govern Rome, he sought to avenge himself upon it. To the people, his madness was a rumor turned spectacle. To the elite, it was a living sentence. Caligula did not just destroy bodies, he destroyed symbols. In his hands, the imperial crown ceased to be an institution and became a dangerous game, a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of the human soul. Thus began his reign, with fear, with blood, and with a banquet. A feast where laughter mingled with terror, and every glance toward the emperor was a silent plea to keep breathing. No one in Rome knew it yet, but that pale young man with the sharp smile had inaugurated a new era, the age of limitless power, the age of the god who looked in the mirror and saw a crowned monster. Before becoming the most feared emperor of Rome, Caligula had been a child who walked among soldiers, a small boy dressed in a miniature armor and tiny leather boots that earned him the nickname that would follow him to the grave, Caligula, Little Boots. His real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, a title inherited from a lineage both glorious and cursed. Son of Germanicus, the most beloved general of the legions, and Agrippina the elder, a direct descendant of Augustus, he was destined for greatness. But in Rome, glorious destinies tended to rot before they could bloom. His childhood unfolded among military camps and triumphal parades. The soldiers adored him, lifted him on their shoulders, and laughed as he imitated his father's marching steps. He was the son of a hero, the living promise of Rome's future. But when Germanicus suddenly died in Syria, the myth shattered. The army quietly whispered what no one dared say aloud, that Emperor Tiberius had poisoned Rome's most popular general out of fear of his fame. The death of his father marked Caligula for life. His mother, Agrippina, demanded justice and openly accused the throne of murder. Tiberius responded coldly, with exile, surveillance, and death. One by one, Caligula's brothers vanished. His mother was banished to an island, where she starved to death. Still a teenager, he was torn from what remained of his family and taken to the place where rumor said the human soul was irreversibly corrupted, the island of Capri. Capri, under Tiberius, was more than an imperial residence. It was a labyrinth of dark pleasures, conspiracies, and fears disguised as luxury. There, the aging emperor ruled over a court of informers, courtiers, and executioners. In its gardens and corridors echoed false laughter and muffled screams. Caligula watched it all in silence, learning the most valuable lesson about power. In Rome, survival belonged not to the virtuous, but to the silent. For 6 years, he lived under Tiberius's gaze, attending his banquets, enduring his suspicion, witnessing how betrayal became an art. The young man had no escape, but he learned how the game was played. He pretended obedience, concealed his hatred, and waited. Chroniclers say his smile was so serene that even Tiberius came to believe he had found a docile heir. But beneath that calm, a silent rage was growing, a thirst for vengeance that would only deepen with time. When Sejanus, the powerful praetorian prefect and executioner of half of Rome, fell from grace and was executed, the balance of power trembled. Tiberius was aging, and the empire needed an heir. In that vacuum, Caligula emerged like a patient shadow. He spoke little of politics and showed no ambition, but everyone knew he was the last survivor of a family exterminated by the throne. When Tiberius finally died, suffocated, some say, by Caligula's own hand, the boy with the little boots became emperor. What Rome celebrated as the dawn of a new era was, in truth, the beginning of its nightmare. Caligula had learned since childhood that power is not inherited, it is conquered, faked, and worn like a mask. And beneath the white toga of the emperor beat the heart of a monster. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, Rome breathed a sigh of relief. His long and somber reign had left the city exhausted by fear. In that climate of weariness, the figure of Caligula, young, charismatic, and a descendant of Germanicus, seemed like a miracle. Crowds filled the streets to acclaim him. The people saw in him the heir to Augustus' golden lineage, the son of the unjustly fallen general, the avenger of an oppressive age. In the first months of his rule, everything seemed to confirm that hope. Caligula abolished unpopular taxes, freed political prisoners, allowed the exiles to return, and organized grand spectacles in honor of the people. He distributed gifts, multiplied public banquets, and ordered sacrifices to the gods in gratitude for his rise. The Senate, the merchants, the soldiers, everyone adored him. Rome had not felt such euphoria since the days of Augustus. Even his face, engraved on the coins, seemed to radiate youth and confidence. Mothers showed their children his image as a symbol of the empire's rebirth. Chroniclers describe him walking the streets with studied simplicity, greeting the commoners, listening to petitions, smiling at the cheers. For a brief moment, Caligula was the emperor of dreams, human, approachable, almost kind. But that illusion lasted as briefly as a flame beneath the wind. Barely 6 months after his coronation, the new emperor suddenly fell gravely ill. Sources speak of high fever, convulsions, and delirium that kept him near death for weeks. All of Rome prayed for his recovery, temples were filled with offerings, priests begged for his life, and the people wept outside the palace. When he finally recovered, the celebrations were so exuberant that days of public festival were declared throughout the empire. Yet something had changed. That illness, or perhaps the abyss he had touched, transformed him forever. The young emperor returned to power with a different gaze, colder, more distant. Where there had been compassion, contempt began to grow, where there had been charisma, arrogance took root. From then on, Caligula began to act as if he had returned from the afterlife with a divine mission. Some believed he was convinced that he had died and been resurrected as a god. Others thought his suffering had driven him mad. Whatever the truth, the man once loved by all began to build a reign in which devotion had to become worship and obedience, a form of cult. The emperor who had promised to restore liberty now prepared to destroy it with a smile. Rome still cheered him, unaware that behind that smile, the delirium of a god demanding human sacrifices was taking shape. Caligula's return after his illness marked the beginning of a new era, an era ruled by fear and sacred extravagance. Something inside him had broken. The emperor no longer saw himself as a mere mortal sitting on Rome's throne, but as a deity made flesh. It was not enough to be the successor of Augustus. Caligula wanted to be worshipped as Jupiter, as Neptune, as the very sun. The metamorphosis was not sudden but gradual. It began with symbolic gestures. He appeared before the Senate wearing gold-embroidered robes, demanded to be addressed with divine titles, and ordered that sacrifices to the gods also include his name. Then came the temples. He commanded altars to be erected in his honor and had his image placed alongside the traditional gods. In some temples, he even decapitated statues of the most revered deities to replace their heads with his own. Each of these acts was more than vanity. It was an open challenge to the very structure of Roman religion, which depended on the balance between men and gods. Caligula deliberately shattered that balance, as if to prove that no power, celestial or human, could rival his own. Suetonius writes that during festivals he appeared dressed as the deities he claimed to embody, wearing the armor of Mars, the blue cloak of Neptune, or the attributes of Venus, painting his body and face to imitate the sheen of statues. The priests trembled at the sight of him, unsure whether to worship or fear him. Caligula delighted in that confusion. He was fascinated by seeing men kneel before him, uncertain if they did so out of faith or terror. But his delusions of grandeur did not stop in Rome. The emperor sought to impose his divinity beyond its borders. In Judea, he ordered a statue of himself to be erected in the Temple of Jerusalem, the holiest site of Judaism, where the law forbade any human representation. The order was a direct provocation, a bomb ready to explode. Only the intervention of Herod Agrippa, the emperor's childhood friend, prevented an open war. To the people, however, each new excess seemed an act of magnificence. The masses, accustomed to spectacle, saw in their emperor a being beyond the human. In the amphitheaters, the crowds cheered as he appeared in golden processions, surrounded by incense and priests. All of Rome became his stage, and he, its acting god. Most disturbing of all, Caligula truly believed in his own divinity. It was not merely a political strategy, it was a sick conviction. According to chroniclers, he often held conversations with statues of the gods, mocking them when he received no reply. At times, he ordered sacrifices to please Jupiter, only to laugh afterward and declare that no god existed but himself. His nights filled with private rituals where religion blended with orgy, power with blasphemy. In the imperial palace, incense mixed with wine, and priests mingled with courtiers. Caligula no longer distinguished the temple from the throne, nor worship from obedience. Everything had to revolve around him, like planets around the sun. Rome, the city that had conquered the world through reason and law, was now ruled by madness. The emperor who should have been the symbol of order had become a deranged deity demanding absolute adoration. And while senators remained silent and the people pretended to revere him, one thought began to take form in the shadows of the imperial corridors: if Caligula was a god, only death could make him human again. Under Caligula's reign, Rome ceased to be an imperial capital and became a theater of fear. The emperor had turned power into a permanent performance, a spectacle in which he was actor, director, and judge. In his world, the line between entertainment and torture vanished, life and death became mere tools to feed his desire for absolute control. The imperial feasts were the favorite stage for his depravity. Banquets, which in the time of Augustus symbolized the refinement of the elite, became under Caligula a ritual of domination. Guests reclined on couches covered in silk while naked slaves served delicacies from across the empire: peacocks from Asia, oysters from Britain, wine from Crete, fruits brought from Egypt. Everything smelled of luxury and danger. No one knew if they would leave the dinner alive. Amid the music and wine, a single gesture from Caligula was enough to change the atmosphere. His smile, cold, calculated, almost childlike, was the prelude to terror. If a guest yawned, if a senator failed to laugh at the right moment, or if someone averted their gaze, it could be their last night. The emperor delighted in watching fear, that silent tremor that swept through the room whenever he uttered someone's name. Suetonius recounts that more than once he interrupted the banquet to point at a guest and command, "Take him to the arena." Sometimes the punishment was immediate: the man was dragged to the nearby amphitheater and forced to fight a gladiator or a wild beast. Other times, he simply vanished, and the next day his body was displayed in the square as a reminder of imperial omnipotence. But the most disturbing part was not the public violence, it was the intimacy of abuse. In the middle of the banquet, Caligula would choose the wives of his allies, take them to his chambers, and return minutes later to describe every detail before everyone, laughing, humiliating. It was not merely pleasure, it was a way to annihilate the will of those around him. He turned submission into spectacle, desire into punishment, shame into his most loyal ally. No one dared protest. The men applauded while trembling. The women feigned indifference. And he, intoxicated by power, found in that silence a music sweeter than any melody. Caligula's sadism reached its peak in the games and executions. Unlike other emperors who merely observed the gladiatorial fights, he turned them into reflections of his diseased mind. He personally selected the fighters, chose the weapons, decided when one should die and when another should be forgiven to prolong the show. At times, he ordered unarmed men to face wild beasts just to see how long suffering could stretch before death. His own participation in combat was one of the most grotesque scenes of his reign. He descended into the arena dressed as a warrior, facing a gladiator armed only with a wooden sword. When the man surrendered, Caligula drew a real dagger and killed him without hesitation. The crowd fell silent. Some thought they should applaud, but he silenced them with a glacial stare. Then he raised his arms and shouted, "I have won." That act was not a display of courage, but a theatrical manifestation of madness, a god-made man proving his right to decide who deserved to live. The excesses did not end in the arena or the palace. In his desire to eternalize his glory, Caligula ordered the construction of 2 gigantic ships on Lake Nemi, true floating palaces covered in marble, gold, and mosaics. There he hosted endless feasts where wine flowed like blood and the music never ceased. The guests were chosen from among the empire's most refined, and most servile. The banquets blended with rituals of adoration to his own person, while slaves and courtiers fulfilled any wish, no matter how repulsive. Decades later, when archaeologists recovered the remains of these ships, they discovered they were no myth or exaggeration, they truly existed. Caligula had brought excess to the realm of architecture. Every column, every mosaic, every ornament spoke of a mind that confused luxury with divinity, pleasure with power. On those ships, surrounded by echoes, wine, and bodies, the emperor felt eternal. But eternity never lasts in the hands of men who believe themselves gods. While the people watched from afar, Rome was slowly sinking under the weight of his madness. The empire still functioned, yes, but every decree, every gesture of the emperor was another crack in its structure. The blood spilled in his banquets was the same that stained the political heart of Rome. The empire Caligula had shaped to his will began to crumble long before his death. Outwardly, Rome still functioned, senators met, soldiers patrolled, the people applauded in the circuses. But beneath that facade, fear was the true emperor. No one trusted anyone. A whisper could cost a life, a misunderstood glance could drag an entire family into exile or execution. The very air seemed poisoned by paranoia. Senators feigned loyalty, but every ovation in the Senate was a desperate attempt to survive one more day. The upper classes, humiliated by the emperor's whims, began to conspire in silence. The Praetorians, charged with his protection, had become his most dangerous jailers. They watched him parade dressed as a god, proclaiming his immortality, and realized that this man was not divine, but an abyss that could drag the entire empire down with him. His end was forged in the same corridors where he had celebrated his greatest excesses. At the beginning of the year 41 CE, Caligula was planning a series of grand spectacles, new races, public executions, and a parade in which he would present himself as the new Sunday. He believed himself invulnerable. But among those who pretended to applaud him was Cassius Chaerea, an officer of the Praetorian Guard whom the emperor had repeatedly humiliated in public. He called him a coward, forced him to give orders in an effeminate voice, and mocked his honor. That humiliation, repeated for months, became a silent promise of revenge. On January 24, 41 AD, Caligula attended a private performance at the palace. As he walked through a narrow corridor, surrounded by his escort, Quiria raised his voice and shouted the password. The moment had come. The sword fell with force. The first blow was not fatal, but it was enough to break the silence. Other Praetorians joined the ambush. Screams echoed through the marble hallways. Caligula, the self-proclaimed living god, fell under the very weapons he once believed he controlled. When the emperor's body was found, it was unrecognizable. The guards had not only killed him, they had disfigured him, as if trying to erase his face from history. They also killed his wife, Caesonia, and his young daughter, Julia Drusilla, fearing that the monster's blood might claim the throne. The entire city of Rome fell silent. For hours, no one knew whether to celebrate or fear the future. For the first time in decades, the Senate dreamed of restoring the Republic. But the dream was short-lived. The Praetorian Guard, aware of its power, proclaimed Claudius, Caligula's uncle, as the new emperor. Rome had a Caesar once again, and the cycle of absolute power continued. Caligula's madness had ended, but the system that allowed it remained intact. Years later, historians would debate whether Caligula was truly insane or simply the clearest mirror of the empire. Some portrayed him as mentally ill, others as a cruel genius who took the deification of power to its ultimate extreme. Whatever the truth, his figure endured because he represented the most dangerous boundary a ruler could cross, the point where power ceases to be a tool and becomes an obsession. Caligula was not just a tyrant, he was the living reminder that limitless power does not illuminate, but corrupts, distorts, and ultimately destroys. His name was etched into the memory of Rome, not for his laws or conquests, but for the echo of fear he left behind. Even today, over 2,000 years later, his story resonates as a warning: when men begin to believe they are gods, empires begin to die from within. To grasp the magnitude of the delusion that enveloped Rome under Caligula, one must imagine the most powerful city in the world turned into a stage. Every corner of the imperial palace, every temple, every main street became part of the emperor's personal theater. His life was no longer governance, it was performance. And in that play, everyone, senators, soldiers, slaves, and lovers, were actors forced to play their roles under threat of death. Public spectacles became rituals of submission. In the amphitheater, Caligula did not merely watch from the box, he intervened, pointed, and decided with a gesture who would live and who would die. The emperor's thumb had more power than all the laws of the Senate. It was said he particularly enjoyed making the audience wait for hours, only to appear at the end and order the execution of a gladiator or, on occasion, a random spectator. It was his way of demonstrating that life in Rome, even that of free men, depended on his mood. During banquets, his cruelty reached theatrical dimensions. The diners knew they were not attending a dinner, but a test of obedience. Caligula observed, evaluated, provoked. If someone laughed at the wrong moment or showed disgust at a dish, a single glance from him was enough to seal their fate. His pleasure did not reside solely in luxury, in oriental wines, oysters from Britain, or perfumes from Arabia, but in the fear he could evoke. He enjoyed measuring the limits of obedience among those around him. Suetonius recounts a scene that chillingly summarizes his madness. In the middle of a dinner, the emperor burst into laughter. A confused senator asked what was so amusing. Caligula replied, thinking that with a single command I could have all of you slaughtered before finishing the wine. Then he drank calmly, enjoying the silence he himself had sown. But the excess was not limited to violence. Caligula pushed sensuality and transgression to the extreme. At his banquets, bodies were as much part of the feast as the delicacies. Nobles and plebeians could be called to satisfy the emperor's whims in front of everyone. The erotic and the sacred merged in a carnival of power, where pleasure was another form of humiliation. For him, every desire had to be fulfilled, not out of lust, but out of domination. To love, to possess, or to destroy were equivalent gestures, manifestations of his divinity. The palace ships on Lake Nemi were the culmination of this cult of excess. True engineering marvels, they floated on the water like temples of marble and gold. On them, Caligula held ceremonies dedicated to his own grandeur. Guests drank until they lost consciousness, surrounded by statues, columns, and mosaics depicting the gods, with the emperor's face. In these spaces, the boundary between pleasure and delirium completely vanished. There were no rules, only his will. In the eyes of the people, the emperor remained a fascinating spectacle. His gestures were unpredictable, his presence magnetic. Some feared him, others adored him, but all watched. Rome had gone from admiring the Caesar to fearing the god he claimed to embody. And while the city burned with feasts, plots, and rumors, Caligula convinced himself that no earthly power could challenge him. The problem was that in his obsession with being worshipped, he forgot what truly sustained his throne, the fear of the powerful. Humiliated senators, mocked officers, and betrayed allies began to realize that the only way to survive was to eliminate the monster they themselves had fed. And so, in the golden corridors of the Palatine, where wine flowed like blood and gold covered the walls, his end began to take shape. Caligula's end did not come with rebellions or invading armies. It came with a whisper, in the shadows of the very palace that had witnessed his excesses. Rome did not erupt in arms, it simply grew tired of fear. The men around him, the same ones who had cheered him, the same ones who pretended to worship him as a god, began secretly plotting his demise. The conspiracy was born among the Praetorians, the emperor's personal guards. They had seen more than anyone, arbitrary punishments, public humiliations, bloody whims. Among them stood Cassius Quiria, a veteran officer whom Caligula constantly despised and ridiculed, mocking his weak voice and forcing him to repeat obscene passwords during the watches. That constant mockery became the fuel for betrayal. On January 24, 41 AD, the emperor attended a theatrical performance inside the palace. He was relaxed, surrounded by courtiers, guards, and musicians. No one imagined that the final act of his life was about to begin. As he walked down a narrow corridor toward his chambers, he was intercepted by a group of conspirators led by Quirius. The first strike came without warning, a stab to the neck. Caligula managed to cry out, but his voice was drowned by the fury of his assassins. He was subjected to a storm of stabs, according to chronicles, more than 30, while trying to shield his face with his hands. None of those present intervened. Neither the guards nor the servants lifted a finger. It was as if all of Rome, through these men, was unleashing upon his body the weight of 4 years of fear. His wife, Caesonia, and his young daughter, Julia Drusilla, were killed shortly afterward. The Senate, upon hearing the news, tried to restore the Republic, believing that the empire had died with him. But the Praetorians, still hungry for power, proclaimed Claudius, Caligula's uncle, as the new emperor. Once again, Rome chose order over freedom. Caligula's body was hastily buried in an anonymous tomb, yet his name never rested. Over the centuries, he became synonymous with tyranny, madness, and the absolute corruption of power. Some portrayed him as mentally ill, others saw him as the inevitable product of a system that worshipped men as gods and then destroyed them when their reflection became unbearable. Suetonius described him as a monster dressed in purple. Tacitus saw him as the ultimate example of how power can devour the soul. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Caligula was not merely a tyrant, he was a distorted mirror of the world that created him. An empire that had made spectacle its religion ended up producing an emperor who turned horror into entertainment. His story remains alive because it embodies a universal warning: when power becomes a cult, when a ruler confuses obedience with worship, the state ceases to be an institution and becomes an altar. And on that altar, sooner or later, the false god becomes the sacrifice.